Welcome all to ELIAMEP's webinar on Alessio Terzi's book, Growth for Good, Reshaping Capitalism to Save Humanity from Climate Catastrophe. which was published last week, right, Alessio, by Harvard University Press. This is a wonderful book, which I urge you all to read. It addresses the most pressing issue facing humankind, which is what needs to be done to save the planet, or more precisely, as my biologist friends correct me, to save human life on the planet, because the planet is likely to survive humans. This may sound slightly daunting to you, and it is to some extent, but I hasten to say that the book brims with optimism. Its main message is that it is possible, though by no means easy, to harness capitalism's animal spirits through concerted public action in order to bring about growth that is not only fast, but also sustainable and even inclusive. So I'm delighted to host the author. Alessio Terzi is currently at the European Commission's Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs, and also a lecturer at Sciences Po in Paris, and was until recently an affiliate of Bruegel, and before that a Fulbright scholar at the Harvard Kennedy School. I have asked Alessio to give us a flavor of his book in about 20 minutes, which is not very nice, but that's all we have, after which I will give the floor to our three panelists, which I will briefly introduce now. Anna Diamantopoulou, as everyone knows, has had his distinguished career as a minister and as a European Commissioner for Employment and Social Affairs. More recently, she was a runner-up as a candidate for the post of OECD Secretary General, and she faced very long odds, and she reached the final in football terms. She currently chairs the high-level group on the future of social protection and of the welfare state in the EU. And if that were not enough, she's also the president of DIKTIO, the Network for Reform in Greece and Europe. Our second panelist is Phoebe Koundouri, whose most impressive distinction is definitely not that she used to be my colleague when I too taught at the Athens University of Economics and Business. Because you see, Phoebe is one of the greatest environmental economists internationally and the current president of the European Association of Environmental and Natural Resource Economists, a position that she somehow combines with co-chairing the UN's Sustainable Development Network in Europe, not to mention her day job as a prolific researcher. Our third and final panelist is Emmanuella Doussis, who is a professor at University of Athens. She holds a UNESCO chair on climate diplomacy, and she is my colleague here at ELIAMEP as a senior policy advisor. I'm Manos Matsaganis. I'm the coordinator of ELIAMEP's Greek and European Economy Observatory, and I'm a professor at Polytechnic University of Milan. Before I give the floor to Alessio, let me just say that I have asked all four speakers to reflect on two additional questions that are related to the book's theme. The first is the role of the Recovery and Resilience Facility in accelerating green growth. And the second is the implications of the war in Ukraine for climate change, which is a topic on which Alessio wrote an article that was published a couple of weeks ago in Foreign Policy. So Alessio, over to you.
Very good. You did your homework, Manos. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm extremely delighted to be here, to be at ELIAMEP, which is an organization I learned to appreciate when I was a fellow think tanker at Bruegel, and we had great collaborations. And I'm really delighted to be here, and especially so to speak about something that is very close to my heart, which is the book you mentioned and the topic that the book covers. You gave me a daunting task, as you described it, of going through the book in 20 minutes. I might even try and be driven by selfishness. I will try even to be briefer than that in order to allow for even more discussion or to hear even more from the great panelists that you assembled to discuss on issues surrounding the book. I find that the best way to give a flavor of what the book is about is to describe the genesis of this book, and so how I ended up writing on these issues. I myself come from, let's say, a background of economic growth. Let's say that's what I wrote my PhD about. That's what I wrote an array of policy papers also when I was a think tanker. So that's a bit the angle from which I was coming. And then COVID arrived, and you might remember the early phases of COVID. It was the lockdown, so we were stuck at home. There was a new disease spreading, so governments asked everybody to stay at home, and everything was going bad, let's say. So there was a health crisis, health outcomes were bad, the economy was tanking, so that was bad as well. And for those that were looking for some type of silver lining, perhaps the only positive element was that nature was healing, as some newspapers let's say, called it. And this could be seen in the fact that CO2 emissions were dropping, in the fact that air quality was improving, in the fact that water quality was improving, in the fact that at some point, even on social media, we saw pictures of dolphins in Venice's canals. Now, later on, these pictures were shown to be fabricated, but the point sort of stuck with me. So this drew me into reflecting on, could it be, looking forward, given that we have to bring down these CO2 emissions, these greenhouse gases, and in a way reconcile ourselves with nature, could it be for the future, even once COVID is long gone, that we sort of need to curtail the economy in order to save the environment, or to save ourselves, as you said, from catastrophic climate change? And this was a bit how the reflection started on these issues. And so the question was, what is the relationship between the economy, economic growth, and climate change / nature? And then rapidly, if you start reflecting on these issues, you rapidly get dragged into the inevitable, which is adding an extra layer, which is capitalism. And so you have economic growth, capitalism, and nature, and you start reflecting on what is the relationship between these three elements of this holy or unholy trinity. And so what is the relationship between growth and capitalism? Is it capitalism that forces us to grow, as some say, whereas people would be relatively indifferent, or is it the other way around? What is the relationship between economic growth and nature, which is what I was mentioning? What is the relationship between capitalism and nature? So can capitalism cope with the fast tracking of a green wave and decarbonization wave that allows us to reach the Paris Agreement goals? And that's it in a nutshell. So that is what the book is about. If I had to really summarize it in one moment, when doing this reflection, I really approached the whole issue with a very open heart. So I've realized when speaking to fellow authors now that a lot of people tend to write a book in the following way. So they sort of know what they want to do, what they want to say, and then they sort of build around the argument to make their narrative compelling. And this is not how this book was written. So I didn't sit down and know where this was going to take me. I started with a set of questions. And as it often happens, when trying to answer one question, this opened up new questions. And while I was trying to answer all of this, I had the pleasure, or at least one of the things that I found most interesting, at least to me, but I hope also to the reader, is that then I was forced to borrow from different literatures. which again is something that we as economists get often accused of not doing or not doing enough. And instead, because I was trying to answer things that are not necessarily always falling in the remit of narrow economics, I was pushed into reading more about what sociology has to say on some of these issues, what anthropology has to say on some of these issues, what even philosophy at some point, because you realize that then reflections on, you know, why people accumulate power and wealth, or why they use objects to convey certain things like status or self-express and so on, or discussions that have been going on in human reflections for a very long time. And so also there's a very strong historical angle that the book takes in trying to see whether some of the issues, some of the challenges that we have right now have some parallels with the past. How technology needs to spread now, how it did in the past, and so on and so forth. So all this to say that this is not a narrow economics book. It started perhaps with an economics angle, but then it became much wider. And the other point that I think is important is that if you only heard this or me talking up to here, it sounds like a very abstract book. So it sounds like I got lost into the rabbit hole of Alice in Wonderland and ended up doing all this philosophical, historical reflection on nature and humanity and what economic growth is and whether economic growth started with the Industrial Revolution or not, which are all elements that are there. But the second part of the book, in part, reflects a bit my multiple hats. So I come from an academic background, let's say, and I have been doing academic and research work, but I also am very much of a policy person, both before in a think tank and now in an institution. And so I really wanted to do the legwork or the deeper thinking, but always to reflect on the repercussions that this would have on a very tangible, very practical policy agenda in order to achieve our goals. And so the second part of the book is extremely practical, and it has some reflections on, you know, cooperation, so more of geopolitics of climate change, and so what kind of cooperation can we expect on this front. It lays out an agenda to green capitalism, and then finally there is something that I've discovered most, let's say, people in the broader world are less interested in, but economists are extremely interested in, which is what falls under the so-called green macro these days. And so this reflection on what happens even if we just roll out the green transition in the way that we have foreseen it with a Green Deal or Build Back Better in the United States type of mental framework, what happens to economic growth? And there, what I try to argue is that actually I believe that economic growth will accelerate and will accelerate immensely, and that perhaps the way we model these things these days, or we try to use standard econometrics techniques to project what is going to happen to growth, are probably not the best way to go about it. And that in a way, the decarbonization I envision is closer to an industrial revolution type of challenge or opportunity. And therefore that countries and business have a very strong self-interest in trying to be at the forefront of this revolution. And so I try to free myself of this narrative where we're just doing it for a next generation or because we have a moral duty to decarbonize. But it is really also, it's also business smart. And that eventually, in a very close future, and actually already in the present for certain technologies, the green option and the cheap option and the best option are all going to be aligned. And so it's going to make perfect sense also from a narrow business perspective to invest in these things, and as a country to try and be at the forefront of this industrial revolution. In a way, and I conclude with this, I always try to reflect on who would be a good audience for this book, also because the editor was constantly prodding me in reflecting on who I was writing for and therefore who their potential market could be. And I mean, my answer would be that in my mind, it should be to a very broad audience because it covers, for an audience that includes anybody that has an interest in the economy, in nature, and in the future of the planet to a certain extent. So it's a very wide audience, I believe. But in a way, it's also targeted a bit more narrowly to Generation Z and millennials. So younger generations, let's say like mine and below, who have seen limited growth in their lifetime because we graduated basically around the global financial crisis, then there was the Eurozone crisis, then there has been secular stagnation, then there has been a COVID crisis, now there's a war. So in a way, a lot of people in my generation and younger are not entirely convinced, and rightly so, or I can see why this criticism has arisen, that economic growth is useful and that they stand to benefit from this, especially if you add the fact that in certain countries, much of this growth is sort of accruing to the top 1% or to big corporations and so on, and so that the benefits of growth are not spreading necessarily to the whole of society. And this book instead tries to argue that, you know, economic growth can be a force for good, and that's a bit what the title tries to hint, but this doesn't happen on its own. And that capitalism can be a force for good and can be a useful ally also in fighting climate change, but it doesn't happen on its own. And so while the book is optimistic, as you rightly point out, Manos, it's also not Panglossian. It's not, it doesn't call for people to lay back, relax, and wait for capitalism or growth to just unleash all these marvels. Rather, it is a call to action, and it is a call to action to everybody in society, really. It's because this can happen, and there's a lot that governments can do. So obviously, the book lays out a very broad policy agenda, but that's not sufficient. So this is not only a government agenda, it is also an agenda that calls for businesses, for pioneering businesses that to be at the forefront of this decarbonization, and also for citizens, for engaged citizens. And so a bit we need this whole of society approach if these things are to happen, if growth is to return to be a force for good, capitalism is to become green, and if we are to win this challenge and avoid a climate catastrophe. And I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessio. That was really useful. Without further ado, I'm giving the floor to Anna Diamantopoulou, who I know has lots of interesting reflections. Anna, over to you.
Thank you very much, Manos, and I really thank you for this invitation in ELIAMEP. I think that we could undermine the fact that in the panel there are 3 women and the coordinator is a man, because in Greece it always happens the opposite. There are only men and the coordinator is a woman. So this is a very interesting and nice panel, and I'm really very enthusiastic with the book and with Alessio, who is so young. The book is a multi-page book, so it's not easy to be read. But if you start reading it, you find so many interesting ideas and the conclusions and the connections. And I think it's, as you already said, I think it is it is really valuable for everybody to read this book. Now, I will start from a paragraph who really shocks me. And I am in an age that I'm not shocked very easily. So Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft cumulatively consume as much energy as New Zealand, a prosperous country of 5 million inhabitants. Maybe you who are all day deal with the issue of environment, you know things like that. But for me, it was really a shock. This simple yet shocking reality shows the paradox and the harmful capitalism can often be. And this is a book that aims to reconcile the relationship between capitalism and the economic growth. It begins by asserting that as it stands, economy growth is based on fossil fuel. The growth is based on fossil fuel growth, and this is becoming more and more harmful to the planet. I think that Alessio explained it, but I believe that the book's ultimate goal is presenting a way out, a realistic pathway for green growth. And he tries that in the existing framework, in the framework of capitalism and of the capitalist price-based economy. The book is divided in two parts: growth, green growth, and degrowth, and each examining a different theory in order to see how we can eradicate the problems connected with climate change. He ultimately stands for the green growth and not for the degrowth. And he's stating, and I'm reading again, that climate change is too important an issue to allow ideology to blind us to truth. For the author, choosing not to abandon the growth mandate is a conscious choice and is very well analyzed. I will focus on the issue of the welfare state because he makes it very clear that the growth is totally fundamental for the society because, as we know, the governments for the government, it's the only way to finance the welfare state and everything which is important for the citizens. I mean, education, health, and culture. Opting for the degrowth, I'm not going to stay there because the author himself, with very concrete arguments, proves out that it is almost impossible. But I would like just to say a few words that opting to degrowth would mean a shrinking economy. It would mean job losses. The resources would be scarcer. So with unemployment, we would have unrest. And it is obvious that we're not going to have social peace and what we believe that comes with the growth. The second big approach and the second interesting approach, and Alessio has already referred to that, is this disconnect towards the growth imperative. It is obvious that the existing economic system is failing us, and Alessio has already given some figures. But capitalism has proven that he is adaptable to any issues, to any problems that are posed on its way. The author highlights that it's a system based on fossil fuels that, if left in this way, it will lead to a climate disaster. On the other hand, while economic growth has been vivid for many, many years and in many countries, the vast majority of people have not benefited from it. On top of it, it destroys the planet. Failure to address these issues have resulted to rise different behaviors to the young people, have led the young people to more extreme alternative choices. It is what it is called the millennium socialism, which is not the socialism we believed 30 years ago, but I'm afraid it is a masked populism. And we have seen it in the United States, we have seen in the elections in France. So it is obvious that young people are not satisfied, do not believe that just growth can change things. Also, he notes that while many seem to believe that advances in technology will reverse the situation and will give new solutions to the climate change, we cannot rest out on hopes on something that has not been invented yet. So it is we need solutions for the worst case scenarios that we do not have alternatives. And I think that it is interesting that he refers to the famous paradox, which deals with the mere fact, while energy efficiency has been constantly improving over the past decades, the emission of CO2 increases and we have not seen to be declined. And there, I think it is always very helpful to use when we speak to people, and particularly to young people, the very simple example with a car, that the car consumes less gasoline per mile and therefore reduces the mile per cost. And this means that with the same price, we can just drive more kilometers. In the final chapter and the conclusions, he offers his blueprint for green capitalism. And he summarizes an inclusive strategies with concrete proposals. And I think that it's very important for policies and for politicians, because analysis is the core of the scientist thought, but in the end, we need always concrete proposals. So what I will do now is that I'm going to link his proposals. There are 9 very concrete ones with the questions that Manos has sent to us. First, before answering to these 2 questions, I would like just to make I would add 2 or 3 thoughts on the proposals that Alessio has already done. The first is that it is obvious that green growth will be the greatest political change. It is totally important to have growth and then green growth. And we need to have growth for the reasons that we have already said, particularly for the welfare state and for supporting the weakest parts of the societies. But it is not easy. And we know that we need to change to change our policies. Now that we work in this group for the reforming of the welfare state, we started with the mega trends, and the most important mega trends was the digital transformation, the climate change, and demography and globalization. And now, because of the war, we can see that there will be lack of resources, because the transformation of money from the budget of social policies to the defense budget. So new problems day by day for the welfare state. And what it is important, it is very important to have new jobs, and to have new jobs in this new revolutionary period of digital transformation and climate change. According to a study that had been presented by the unions at the European level 1 year ago, there was an estimation of 11 million job losses because of the climate change. It is not something which has been documented scientifically, but there is always a fear. So I think what it is very important to add in your ideas is that we need to focus on to indicate what green jobs are, to describe green jobs and to describe the skills for green jobs in order to for governments and ministries to prepare these new educational and training projects for green jobs. The second one, which is important, is that again, from the social point of view, because of the climate change, we have all over the world and all over Europe, we have an increase in natural disasters. And what is needed is new policies, and the governments have to accommodate ensuring their citizens from this hazard. And so there are ideas for new funds which will support people in these cases. And I very much agree what you say for Africa. Africa is the continent which less contributes to the global warming, and it unfortunately it is affected most by it. So what you say about the cancellation of debt, I think it is an imperative. Now, about the Recovery and Resilience Fund, of course, it is supporting the implementation of the European Green Deal. Given that at least 37% of each member investment plan has to be devoted to climate change policies, we understand how important it is, because even if we have environmental skeptical governments, they are obliged to use 37% of this money. And I could just refer to the Greek National Plan, which now includes extensive refurbishing of government buildings, something which is referred to your concrete proposals. And another important issue, you speak very much about the public investments and the need of public investments. And because of this, because of RRF, there is the possibility of public investments of a huge of this caliber, which never had been again at the European level, and this will aid in mitigating the annual investment gap of 260 million euros at an annual level, at the European level. And finally, about I don't know if I have spoken too much, Manos. I haven't seen the time. I have 3 minutes, 1 minute I need more. About the war and Ukraine and the energy transition, if energy transition is easier or not. You know, I had read a book about energy and civilization, a history, and it was interesting. It was referring to these changes during the wars, starting from the 19th century, when we have the naval wars, which had accelerated the transformation from wind to coal-powered vessels. And then it was the First World War, from coal to oil. And then it was the Second World War, from oil to nuclear energy as a major power source. So it is not the same. I mean, the Ukrainian war is not the same, but we can understand that the governments are under huge pressure to eliminate fossil fuel dependence. So they have increased the R&D projects and innovation projects, and not only concerning universities, but industries in all sectors work now on new ideas and innovative approaches in order to find new solutions to the problem. So I believe that the answer is yes. The pressure will be much bigger than the past, and nobody can be easy with what the governments cannot be easy dealt with what they have. So I believe that we can find the good through the bad. What we're looking now, what we're feeling now is going on the world. In the end, I think that this is a very helpful, this book here can be helpful for not only for think tanks or for scientists, but for governments as well. Because these 9 concrete proposals can be developed more and can be a plan for those who want to really change the growth to a green growth. And you have my congratulations.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for these reflections. I will now ask Phoebe Koundouri to take the floor. Phoebe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mano. Thank you, Anna, for your reflections. But most of all, I want to thank Alessio, who disappeared from the stream. Oh, he's back now. Yes, that would be good to show the cover. Most of all, I want to thank Alessio for writing such an engaging and really interesting book, which has a solid scientific basis, and it's enjoyable for economists, mainstream economists. It's enjoyable for environmental economists that are on the cutting edge of these transformations that are needed in order to achieve the growth in a way that does not harm the environment and in a way that supports social cohesion. So exactly, this is the kind of thinking we need, and this is the kind of thinking we need from the generation that Alessio belongs to. I am 10 years older, I think, Alessio, so maybe I'm not the next generation, but I am the generation who was quite poor in terms of mainstreaming the need for green growth, the need for prosperity, understood as a model that produces goods and services while it does not use natural resources in a way that these are depleted or polluted, and at the same time it provides social cohesion and a safety net for the vulnerable in the economy. I was in this decade that nobody really worried too much about inequality, and you bring that issue centrally in your thoughts. Inequality is central because it deprives the economic system for the ability to achieve prosperity for all. And achieving prosperity for all, we all know that creates positive externalities on which welfare is built, on which the welfare state can be built, and on which positive growth multipliers, positive job multipliers, and at the same time, indexes of happiness. That is not just growth of GDP, but growth of all those goods and services, including produce capital, natural capital, human capital, social capital, is achieved. Growth that brings prosperity, growth that makes people happy. And I am now pinching a bit on the happiness economic spectrum. So in my work, if you align me, Alessio, which is basically very aligned to your thoughts and what you did in this book, a book that can be read by scientists, it can be read by policymakers, it can be read by people in financial institutions, it can be read by people in businesses, CEOs, the civil society, it can be read by everybody, it can be understood by everybody, and it's a joy to read. And at the same time, it is a book that does exactly what we need. It brings together many disciplines. Without interdisciplinarity, we are not going to solve any problem. Very few problems can be solved in the silo of one discipline. Most problems are interdisciplinary. The great problems that we are facing today are definitely interdisciplinary. And unless we work in an interdisciplinary framework, unless we educate our citizens, our students, our university students in understanding and analyzing issues in an interdisciplinary framework, we are not gonna provide any solutions that are relevant. Usually I start my speeches with this sketch, which basically shows the different crises that we are facing, the pandemic, the huge economic recession that derives from the pandemic, but is also aggravated due to very expansionary fiscal policy and low investments in the real economy. And now with inflation mounting up, is leading us to a stagflation situation, which is extremely difficult to deal with and handle. Then the climate crisis and the resulting increased frequency of extreme weather conditions, heat waves, floods, forest fires, and so on, and the biodiversity collapse crisis, the loss of the complexity of the food chain, the loss of the ecosystem services on which we base our production and consumption. And together with this, the population crisis, aging population in Europe, increasing population in the developing world, and on top of all this geopolitical crisis. And we know that the world is only as resilient as the least resilient country and person. And it is really, really urgent to find a solution pathway that can deal with all these multiple crises simultaneously. And this is exactly what we are working as the Alliance of Excellence of Research and Innovation on Euphoria. Is a bunch of research centers, European accelerators, and global networks that I have a leading position in, and we work together in order to find the pathway towards reducing the aggravating effects of the multiple crises and identify development solution pathways out of this crisis. But where should the pathways take us? What is our blueprint? I love your 9 action points. I love your recommendations. I love the message you are sending because it is very consistent. It is a cross-mapping of the SDGs. Agenda 2030, the 17 SDGs, this very holistic agenda with 17 goals and 169 targets, which covers everything from geopolitical partnerships to prosperity, economic growth, environmental resilience, and of course, the sustainable interaction between economy, society, and nature. And in our recent report, every year we publish with Jeff Sachs this report. We are co-chairing this report, the financing of the joint implementation of the SDGs and the European Green Deal. And interestingly, Alessio, one of the partners, we have many partners, obviously is led by United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network that I co-chair with Jeff Sachs, but one of our partners is Force for Good. And in your book, you says capitalism should be force for good. And actually Force for Good is a joint venture of many asset management companies that want to accelerate impact investment that really helps facilitate the implementation of the SDGs. I found that your phrase very interesting because it is now used by even people in the financial sector. But of course, we have other partners, many research institutions, but also WENEL Foundation, Climate Kick, the International Energy Agency, and the World Academy of Arts and Science. And the idea is basically the idea you put in your book, that this transition to sustainable growth and to decarbonization and climate resilience should be conceived in a systems approach, simultaneously addressing multiple objectives and promoting the right mixture of policy instruments and technological solutions. And this mixture can be used across the various sectors of the economy and be reinforced by society. And you make a point with regards to the need to co-design the solution pathways
with the whole of the society, the whole spectrum of different stakeholders, from policymakers, politicians, financial institutions, businesses, NGOs, civil society, and of course be science-driven and technologically based. So yes, at the moment, we have the solutions. We don't have all the solutions, but we have enough solutions to get us from our unsustainable pathway to a sustainable one. We have renewables that are cheap and nice to the environment and give us energy independence. We have a huge wave of circular economy that can really save cost and can really reduce the footprint on the environment. We have nature-based solutions, we have climate adaptation projects, we have digitalization, and the right mixture of these technologies, if financed, it can really help us implement the SDGs. And our SDGs is our global agenda, is our blueprint towards the future we want. And it is basically an investment program. It is an investment program. It allows us to highlight which investments we want, which combination of investments we want in order to reach prosperity and the sustainable interaction between the economy, the society, and nature. And it is, of course, reinforced by the climate agreement and the European Green Deal in Europe for access, climate neutrality, reduction of pollution, clean tech leadership for European companies, and social cohesion, leave no one behind. And of course, one of the biggest successes of Europe is the fact that even after COVID, a huge non-linearity, the European Green Deal is still our growth strategy. RFF is financing, as Anna Diamantopoulou says, 37% climate mainstream projects and 20% digital mainstream projects. And of course, we have all these hundreds of pages of regulation in the European Green Deal that try to make explicit all the pathways that will allow us to implement it. The EU taxonomy, the climate law, the Fit for 55. I'm not gonna go there because it's too much. I'm just gonna show you this. This is our deep learning, machine learning analysis that connects the hundreds of thousands of pages of European regulation relevant to the green and digital transition, to the SDGs, and actually connects it to the 6 transformations that the SDGs are claiming. The 6 transformations, we have announced them during the Climate Week in New York, and we work within this framework every year. We showcase at the COP every year the progress of the world, each and every country in the world within, with regards to these 6 transformations. And then the transformations we need to make, and all of these are mentioned in your book, Alessio, are 6: education, gender inequality, health, well-being and demography, energy decarbonization, sustainable industry, sustainable food, land, water and oceans, sustainable cities and communities, and the digital revolution for sustainable development. And our analysis shows that the European Green Deal is really empowering transformation 4 and 3. It's giving a lot of facilitation to transformation on the digital and the sustainable cities, but it's doing less so on social cohesion, transformation 1 and 2. And we also did an analysis of the RFF, a detailed analysis of the RFF in the 7 Southern European member states. And we find that the RFF support the SDGs, but at different degrees. They are very explicit in supporting investments with regard to green energy, electrification of transport, energy efficiency measures, but they give less budget to food systems and diets and biodiversity, which are goals that Europe is underachieving. So we should be quite careful not just investing in decarbonization and energy efficiency. Energy is not the only system we are interested in. The food system is very important. The mobility system is very important. The marine system is very important. So we should be quite careful in supporting all the different systems and supporting the synergies that the different systems are providing. And with regards to jobs, because Anna has mentioned them, well, our estimations together with the International Energy Agency is that this clean energy transition will create 13 million new jobs in the announced pledges scenario, and by 2030, and 26 million new jobs in the net zero scenario by 2050. So it's quite a lot, and this is a global scale, not a European scale. And I want to close with something that Alessio refers quite extensively in his book. It is quite important to understand that we have produced capital, but we also have natural capital and human capital. And in order to take natural capital seriously into account and integrate it in our investment decisions, we need to be able to measure it and monetize it. And in our report, we have a very explicit approach for monetizing natural capital in the terrestrial, marine, and freshwater ecosystems in all the biogeographical regions and marine regions within Europe. And this allows you to know per household how much they are willing to pay for an improvement and a restoration of the different ecosystem services within the ecosystems of Europe. And this is important because it allows you integration of not just produced capital and human capital, but also the value of natural capital in your investment decision. And what is also good news is that the countries that are performing well with regards to the SDGs are the countries whose citizens are willing to pay for natural capital. I will stop here and just say that today we've launched the Sustainable Development Report, the Global Sustainable Development Report of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And unfortunately, since 2019, we have a stagnation, no improvement with regards to SDG implementation. This is not to say that before we were doing great, but we had a level of improvement which was allowing us hope for transition to sustainability. Now the war is creating huge issues. And the war is it's aggravating the energy crisis that started before the war. The energy crisis started because of climate change mainly, and supply disruptions from COVID. Climate change because we have very cold winter, very hot summer, energy demand increase, COVID supply disruptions, reduced supply, and we faced increased prices. These were aggravated by the war. Together with the energy crisis, the war brought food crisis, but together with that, the war brought a huge environmental crisis. We are talking about countries that are very important with regards to forest and storage of CO2 and ecosystems. And of course, the war brought a humanitarian crisis. And I do hope that they understand, all of the leaders in the world, that they need to sit down and solve the problem. Nobody will win this war in the field. The war has to stop through negotiations between the leaders so that the humanitarian crisis stops and we are back into, let's say, business as usual, at least in the European area, in order to progress with our struggle to face our unsustainable practices. And to close, we need to care about the developing world. There is enough money in the world, and most money is not in the public. It's not in public hands. Most money are in private hands. But there is enough money in the world and enough technology in the world to solve our problems. But it's, as Alessio says, it's the distribution of this money that is problematic. And this is a huge problem that we need to solve very, very quickly. And we need to show solidarity to the less developed countries. We need to transfer resources through multilateral financial instruments, increase the funding to multilateral banks, and even tax the mega rich in order to have funds to support the development of the less developed low-income countries. Because without the low-income countries, we cannot solve any crisis. And the end result will be that not only them will be facing huge destruction, Europe and the developed world will face this destruction as well. The problems are global and the solutions have to be global. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Phoebe. That was great, very lively as well as illuminating. And now I will give the floor to our third and final panelist, Emmanuella Doussis. Emmanuella, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this wonderful panel and for the opportunity to share with you some thoughts on Alessio's book, which is a very important contribution on the debate concerning the relationship between capitalism, economic growth, and climate change. Well, when I got beyond the title of the book, I realized that it actually tries to situate that debate as a real dilemma that faces politicians, enterprises, and people. Well, Alessio goes back to the heart of the problem and explores whether and how economic growth can continue while simultaneously reducing carbon emissions. And he does so by exploring the socioeconomic trends, among others, to draw lessons for the climate agenda. But what is actually the growth dilemma? Unsustainable, untenable. Well, for Alessio, growth is unsustainable as it stands. Degrowth is untenable. It is not a realistic nor a feasible option. So what are the choices? Build the foundations differently, argues the author, and find the societal and economic dynamics that will allow humanity to avoid climate catastrophe. If we think about the fundamentals of the economy in a different way, we can actually break that dilemma. And then Alessio proposes avenues out of the dilemma. He outlines a policy recipe, to use his words, to head off catastrophic climate change. And what I did like is that his proposals are not limited to a to-do list, but highlight the path on how to shape a new green consensus on the foundations of a different kind of economy, the economy of tomorrow. In other words, the book shows how to transform an unsustainable system and build something better by carefully exploring what the new system should like and what the transition should entail. And I should add that Alessio does this in a very thorough way by enriching the text with a lot of grains of political philosophy, literature, even music and cinematography, which makes reading a pleasant intellectual journey. So to add to what has already been said by Anna and Phoebe, I would like to highlight 3 points that seem important to me, having, of course, as a starting point, what the book at hand proposes and Manos' questions. So the first point concerns the need for holistic approaches. There are many different perspectives and many different approaches to arrive at solutions. And it is true that for a long time, climate change has been framed as an environmental problem, thus providing technical or behavioral solutions such as managing greenhouse gas emissions and promoting environmentally friendly lifestyles. When climate change is viewed as a social problem, the solutions expand to include economic, political, institutional, and even cultural changes. And some of these solutions have the potential for transforming society in ways that address multiple goal challenges, including poverty and inequality, food insecurity, biodiversity loss, and health crisis. And as Phoebe said a while ago, the UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 recognize that all these goals issues are linked with the efforts put into tackling climate change, promoting thus holistic approaches. However, there is a large gap between knowledge, concern, and action. Climate crisis calls for the quickest possible action. So the real question is there time for organizing an economic revolution? Can we pull off these changes in time? Well, there are reasons for optimism, and this is the message I get out of the book as well. We still have the potential to introduce positive changes, but we must act quickly. We must act very quickly. Well, the European Union is already a step in front. It has achieved substantial emission reductions in greenhouse gas emissions the last decade, and now it has a very ambitious plan, the European Green Deal, which is the roadmap for sustainability in Europe for the next decades. Well, this plan has multiple readings. The first is an environmental one. It is a plan that attempts to protect the climate and sets as a priority to make Europe a climate neutral continent by 2050. Another reading has an economic and I would say a social connotation. The deal aims to create a sustainable economic model through a series of reforms ranging from the decarbonization of the energy sector to investing in green transport, and from a circular economy restructuring to a new deal for agriculture. What is more is that all these changes for the transition to more sustainable paths should be done in a just way, especially for those who will be most affected, that is the workers and the local communities that have been trapped for decades in polluting activities and now should shift towards sustainable alternatives. Well, although the European Green Deal is somehow a Brussels-led policy, its success depends very much on the national government's willingness to follow the path and update their own plans. Member states should come up with their own responses, with their own decisions on how to achieve a common European goal, thus persuading them to diverge from existing energy infrastructure will be a very big challenge. It is true that the Recovery and Resilience Facility opened a window of opportunity to better deal with climate crisis. And now the war in Ukraine can accelerate the green transition to more sustainable paths because of the need to eliminate quickly Russian supplies. But the question is, who will pay the additional costs? It seems that there are not many options to finance the REPowerEU plan. That is the plan to rapidly reduce dependence on Russian fossil fuel and fast forward the green transition. And the European Union is going to allow more emission allowances, thus reversing the decision taken in 2018 to cancel a surplus of allowances. So 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Had the European Green Deal started 10 years ago, the European Union wouldn't be in this unpleasant and I would say paradoxal situation of incentivizing fossil fuel usage in order to speed up the transition to clean energy. My second point concerns the role of international institutions, mainly global agreements. There is a trend in recent literature, mainly economic literature, to undervalue somehow the role of global agreements in the fight against climate change, pointing out that they are not effective on account of their voluntary nature. Well, while it is true that long delays have hindered international cooperation, it is actually the Paris Climate Agreement that paved the way for bottom-up solutions. Actually, it modified the original idea of setting targets at the international level and called on the states themselves to draft national plans for mitigation and adaptation and review them every 5 years, and all this under international supervision. And this is not a voluntary obligation, but a legally binding one. Citizens and their organizations in the Netherlands, Germany, France, in Ireland, and elsewhere have started to sue their countries in national courts for violation of this obligation because they are not doing enough to curb their emissions. So if we underestimate the value of global international agreements, I think that this will somehow derail the debate on the role of international institutions and maybe lose this very important tool in the battle against climate change. But of course, when you want to have everyone in the conventional circle, especially those who contribute most to the problem of climate change, the final result will be a compromise, but a compromise which can serve as a set of principles to guide the way forward and evolve in their effort to reconcile with the needs of the current reality. And this brings me to my third and last point, which is very, very close to what Phoebe had said a while ago. Networking across boundaries is crucial for success. As long as we are confined to our own silos, we are unlikely to be successful. And the truth is that the walls separating different disciplines, different sectors are still high, and only few people try to climb them. And I think that Alessio belongs in this group. Climate change is a problem that calls for broad interdisciplinarity, and this is recognized by the book from the very beginning. Why so? Because it affects almost every aspect of human activity, from the way we move into cities, from the way we produce and consume, to the way we warm and heat our households. Therefore, there is a need to build better bridges of communication across different disciplines, as well as between science, policymakers, and society. We need to find a common language of communication to inform citizens why the transition is needed and keep them in the loop regarding the dilemmas that arise in this process, to explain that there are no magic solutions, to inform them about the benefits they will reap and how they themselves can also contribute to this effort. So to avoid climate catastrophe, it is not enough for governments or local authorities to take measures on their own, nor for the private sector and the organized civil society to be merely aware of the problem. What is needed is a coordinated mobilizations of all disciplines, all sectors, actors, and citizens in their relevant sectors. The cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of prevention. And I think this is something that the reader gets out of this wonderful book. So these are some thoughts that came to mind while I was reading the book, which is a very, very important contribution to the debate concerning the transition to sustainable pathways. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuella. That was very interesting. Right. Well, the next stage now is to perhaps answer questions from the public or from each other. And while we are waiting for the public's questions or the panelists' questions, I would like to ask Alessio a question of my own, and I will formulate it in a rather roundabout way, so please bear with me. You know, as I said earlier, excuse me, As I said at the beginning, I found this book really delightful. It's full of insights on a wide range of issues and contains lots of thought-provoking ideas. But what I personally found attractive, apart from the author's optimism, and we can all do with a bit of optimism right now, is that he's fair to the ideas it turns out he actually dislikes, which is, well, I don't know, perhaps it's our Mediterranean temperament, but most of us are often guilty of at least occasionally putting up a strawman version, a caricature of our opponent's argument. I myself have done it several times, I'm afraid. Well, Alessio refuses to do that. He treats degrowth with respect before he goes on to effectively counter it. I imagine he was galvanized by the political context in his country, Italy, and the meteoric rise and then fall of the Five-Star Movement, which made degrowth one of its rallying calls. And one of Alessio's arguments against degrowth is that it is highly unlikely to be happy, decrescita felice, as its proponents put it. Instead, Alessio argues, it is bound to set in motion a spiral that will make politics toxic. And here he calls on the rather unpleasant experience of Italy's economic stagnation since the mid-1990s. But here the rest of us can add to his argument, because we are all familiar with the painful experience of our country, Greece, in the 2010s, where the deep and prolonged recession caused widespread misery. Think of, apart from everything else, a country's position in the International Happiness League tables, which tumbled according to all available statistics. And it takes a lot for these statistics to move. They are very slow to change. But in the case of Greece, we lost quite a lot in terms of happiness as imperfectly measured by statistics, let alone that our recession incidentally brought to power a new political class that made most Greeks nostalgic of the previous lot. So my question to Alessio is whether he thinks it might be the case that right now team degrowth is a bit of a spent force, or whether, on the contrary, it is bound to make a comeback later on as perhaps the climate crisis intensifies.
Thanks a lot, Manos. You nested your question within a set of points that I'd love to follow up on, but I'll resist the temptation and I'll stick to replying to your question. I think, I don't know, so obviously I don't have the crystal sphere to know, the crystal ball to know if the movement is on the rise. My impression is it is. And my impression is, well, first, let's say empirically, it's to be noted that the biggest books and therefore the biggest interest in degrowth generally happen in tough times. Let's say the original book on this topic is The Limits to Growth, which started in the 1970s that had some similar conditions to now, let's say. So spiraling energy prices, recession, stagnation, so little growth, the impression that we were running out of raw materials, and this is what fed the interest. And that book ended up selling, 30 million copies, I believe, something like that. So that is similar conditions in the past have led to a growth in the attention into this towards this movement. And then in more recent literature, Tim Jackson's book which again is a bit of a recent manifesto in this front, was published just after the great financial crisis, within 2010. And then Jason Hickel's Less is More was published just after the COVID crisis and that recession that followed. So my impression is that when, let's say, things go badly, it's when people start questioning whether our system is not all wrong and we should look at it in a different way. And so that would be the short answer. My impression is also that it's not necessarily, not necessarily a lot of people sympathize with the movement of degrowth per se and know that the tag and know the whole literature, but some of the elements of it here and there are actually quite widespread, which is something I try to mention also in the book, that some of the persuasions of the school of thought are actually considered conventional wisdom outside of economic circles or people that that spend their day and their professional life reflecting on these issues.
Thank you, Alessio. Anybody else would like to comment, to go back to what was said earlier? We still have 14 minutes on my clock. So if
we have time, I can follow up on a few points that have already been raised by Anna or Emmanuella.
We'll give you the floor for, say, 5 minutes after, you will be last to speak. So I wanted first to ask the other panelists whether they would like to add anything to what was said by others.
Manu, I would like to quickly say that the pace of technological progress in this fourth industrial revolution, it's really unprecedented in human history. And this pace is really a source of hope and optimism because it provides technological solutions that are relevant for the transition to sustainability. However, it is absolutely crucial that we engage in the deployment of these technological solutions for society. So we need to be serious in investing in education, training, reskilling, and upskilling so that the people, the labor force, can really engage in this technological revolution and use the technological advancements in a way that provides solution to environmental problems. It provides solutions to energy production problems, and at the same time, it creates positive job multipliers, and which help economic growth. Economic growth, as we want to measure it, beyond GDP, but in terms of goods and services that support the welfare of the society.
Yes, I share your optimism, really. I also think that the digital revolution, the fourth revolution that is underway, will end up creating more jobs than it destroys, except that the jobs created will be located in different places, in different industries, and perhaps may even concern different workers from the ones in the jobs that will be destroyed. And this is a challenge of reskilling that we are all facing. Anna, would you like to come on?
Yes, thank you. I would like to ask something to Alessio as well. There is a very interesting reference to his book about the need of a mission economy, which means an economy where the actors, the main actors, allow the private sector to play the main role, but there is a guidance by the government and by the state, which is really a message in our times, particularly after the pandemic. But we know very well that the policymakers, the politicians are influenced by the people. And taking into account what is going on in our country, I'm afraid that there is a very, very low level of sensitivity concerning the environmental issues. Maybe there is a sensitivity in the young generation. I haven't seen it very much. I have never seen it in the political youth. I haven't seen it in the organization of the discussion, even in the Facebook. maybe we know the situation is different in the other countries, but okay, the governments are obliged because RRF, because of the Green Deal, to do things, but it is not real their own policy because they have other priorities. And this is my fear. To be frank, I have two fears. The first one is this, and the second one is that the Brussels bureaucracy combining with the national bureaucracy will make things very difficult to be implemented and to have results.
Thank you, Anna. Emmanuella?
Well, to link to what Anna was saying, I'm very much concerned about the European Green Deal and the spread of Green Deals to others. Because at the end of the day, if Europe becomes climate neutral by 2050, this is not going to save the world, since the European emissions count for less than 10% of the global emissions. So here there is a big challenge, how to convince others to follow path, how to work with the neighbors to help them address the consequences of the European Green Deal. Because the Green Deal, it will restructure the relationships with other gas and oil exporting countries, with countries producing raw materials for renewables, with countries that have commercial relations and investment relations because of the CBAM. So what is next?
Thank you, Emmanuella. Alessio, over to you. You have, say, 5-6 minutes to wrap up.
Wonderful. I take the first minute just to thank all of you three and Manos as well for the thorough comments, for the kind words. I was almost blushing while you were all talking about the book. So thanks a lot for reading it and for your comments, which prove also an in-depth reading. Emmanuella, you were mentioning specific examples, which I think are nested in footnotes. So it means you also ventured into that part of the book. So thanks a lot. I was mentioning there are a few points that I wanted just to react, and I'll react also to the questions you raised at the end. I think a point that really resonates is the one on interdisciplinarity. More than one of you mentioned this point, and I think that the fact that I followed an interdisciplinary approach is also the proof that this book is very much a pandemic baby, let's say, or developed during a pandemic crisis, because that's really when we got the sense that the only way to face in a serious way, in a smart way, that type of challenge was to use the knowledge of multiple disciplines. And so that it wasn't only about listening. Obviously, economists could answer some specific questions on how to support the economy when you're in a situation of lockdown, but we didn't know anything necessarily about what was happening with the pandemic. Then you listen to epidemiologists that give you a sense of that. And then you listen to psychologists for the psychological repercussions of the lockdown measures or things like this. So it's really this reality in which the book was written that allowed me to, or really persuaded me of the importance of going interdisciplinary, which again is not something that my home discipline is usually very interested in doing. I liked also, Emmanuella, you raised the point in your initial remarks that you liked the fact that I was focusing on how to get there. And so not only what is needed, but also how do we get there, which I think also goes a bit to the heart of what Anna was raising right now at the end of the feasibility. And again, I think that this, in a way, there's a lot of me in the book, because the book is the reflection of a lot of the experiences I've lived through. And one of them has been, again, this idea of not focusing only on the end state, which again is something that economists tend to do a lot about. We optimize our models, we see what the equilibrium is, and then often, not everybody, obviously, I'm generalizing, I'm using stereotypes, but a lot, I see a lot with a lot of friends, is that we identify the optimal point, the optimal policy, and then the idea is policymakers should just do that, and if they don't, it means that they are stupid or whatever, and that's not it. Actually, politics is the art of making things feasible or driving the car, let's say, or leading the boat to a destination and making that a feasible destination. And so I have great respect in that. I think that it's a respect I developed maybe while I was at the Harvard Kennedy School. So again, when I was broadening my horizons, I wasn't just surrounded by economists anymore. And then you're surrounded by people who want to do politics, who have come from civil society, who come from journalism. And you just see how all these things come together in making policy happen. And then on the final points that you raised, on Phoebe, on the speed of technology, I very much, I don't even know if it's a question in the sense that it's a statement with which I agree a lot. And there is a lot on the book in this, and that's why also in the introductory remarks, I was talking about something that is probably closer to an industrial revolution. But the difference is that with respect to an industrial revolution, here we are using policy to push on the accelerator of an industrial revolution that is already happening. So we're using policy to make the rollout of new technologies and a restructuring of the economy even faster. And we already know from past industrial revolutions that when they take place, even when they take place in a slower way, they generate discontent. And when that happens, there's a lot of tension in society. There's countries, civilizations that have not managed to seize moments of technological change precisely because of the discontent that these would bring. Even if the overall society would benefit, if there are groups of society that feel left behind, they will oppose it. And that's then creating the link between the social dimension and the environmental climate mitigation agenda, because it's really a matter of proceeding on both hand in hand, because if not, one will not happen, which creates a great segue to the point that Anna was making and the importance of citizens and citizens backing this agenda. I'm sitting in Brussels. This is a city where, especially over the past 2 years, as you were hinting, there's a lot of momentum behind the green transition, the green agenda, the Green Deal. I'm surrounded by like-minded people, let's say. So we give for granted that people are behind this and that therefore it's only governments dragging their feet when things don't happen. And I agree that there's a lot that policy can do. The book mentions this, but governments can only do as much as citizens allow them to do. Let's say in broad terms, I'm not speaking at the margin. You also want some leadership on certain issues, but at the end of the day, you cannot do this against people's willingness and persuasion that this is the right their sense of direction for society. And in a way, the book tries also to persuade, or I hope that people that are not necessarily already climate fanatics or Green Deal fanatics that decide to buy it, because I try to make a persuasive argument for them that this is also, that creates a lot of opportunities and that you don't have to become like an environmental fanatic or obsessed with the environment, care about this agenda and want to get behind it, because a lot of opportunities will also come with this. And so even for progressively, I would want to see prices of the green options, as I was mentioning, go down. And so at some point, the green option and the cheap option will be the same. And at that point, you don't even need all of society, all of citizens to be behind you in wanting to go for the cheaper, for the most expensive option, just in the name of a green transition. And just one last point on Emmanuella's importance of the spread of the European Green Deal. I think that's a crucial element. That's why I wrote that chapter, which I think has attracted some of your attention. And I very much agree with you. To a certain extent, the Paris Agreement is very much
the agenda must be national, that it must be nationally determined, but that it can be loosely coordinated so that the sum of the parts adds to something that is meaningful at the global scale. But at the same time, I try to cool off a little bit the enthusiasm of others that I see and around me, who expect these international agreements to become ever more binding, even in their targets, and that these targets can at some point be imposed on government. I don't see this as realistic, because then, linking to Anna was saying, at some point, if people are not aligned, a top-down target will not cut it. And I stop here because we are at 5:30, and I want to be on time. I don't want to be the Italian, classic Italian.
All right, I will now bring this webinar to a close. I thought that was a wonderful discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you, Alessio. Best of luck to your book, In Bocca al Lupo. Many thanks to all our panelists, and many thanks also to those of you who watched us online. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Manos. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.